Imagine standing before a structure so massive, so perfectly engineered, that even with all our modern technology, we struggle to understand how it was built. Now imagine that this monument is over 4,000 years old, constructed by a civilization that emerged from the heart of Africa when most of the world was still living in scattered villages. Before Greece, before Rome, before Babylon, there was Egypt, a kingdom so powerful, so advanced, that it would rule for 3,000 years, longer than any empire in human history. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Ancient Egypt didn't begin with pyramids and golden masks. It began with something far more mysterious, far more African than most history books dare to admit. This is the untold story of how Africa gave a birth to one of humanity's greatest civilizations, a story of Black Pharaohs, forgotten kingdoms, and a legacy that changed the world forever. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. Today, we journey back to the very beginning of recorded civilization, to a time when the Nile River Valley transformed from scattered communities into the most sophisticated society the ancient world had ever seen. In this documentary, we will uncover the true origins of ancient Egypt, tracing its roots deep into African prehistory. We'll explore how the first pharaohs united a divided land, how they built monuments that still defy explanation, and how they created systems of writing, medicine, mathematics, and governance that would influence every civilization that came after. But this isn't just a story about pyramids and mummies. This is a story about African innovation, African spirituality, and African power. We'll examine the evidence that mainstream historians often overlook, the connections between ancient Egypt and other African civilizations, and the deliberate erasure of Egypt's African identity in modern scholarship. We'll meet the pharaohs who ruled as living gods, the priests who guarded sacred knowledge, the architects who built for eternity, and the ordinary people who made it all possible. We'll witness the rise of dynasties, the construction of immortal monuments, and the creation of a culture so influential that its echoes still resonate 5,000 years later. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just how ancient Egypt rose to greatness, but why this story matters today. You'll see how Africa didn't just contribute to world civilization. Africa created the very foundation upon which all other civilizations were built. Let's begin. Our story begins approximately 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. As massive ice sheets retreated across the northern hemisphere, the climate of North Africa underwent a dramatic transformation. What is now the Sahara Desert was once a green, fertile landscape filled with rivers, lakes, and abundant wildlife. Archaeological evidence reveals that ancient African peoples thrived in this region, hunting game, gathering plants, and creating some of humanity's earliest rock art. These weren't primitive savages. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who understood astronomy, tracked seasons, and developed complex spiritual beliefs about their relationship with nature. But around 5000 BCE, the climate shifted again. The Sahara began its transformation into the desert we know today. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual process spanning centuries. As grasslands turned to dust and water sources dried up, the peoples of North Africa faced a choice: migrate or die. Many groups moved southward into sub-Saharan Africa, carrying their knowledge and culture with them, but others turned east toward one of the few water sources that remained reliable, one of the few places where life could still flourish. They turned toward the Nile. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he wasn't exaggerating. This single river, flowing over 4,000 miles from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, created a narrow ribbon of fertility through an otherwise barren landscape. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood, depositing rich dark soil along its banks. This wasn't destructive flooding, but a predictable, life-giving phenomenon. The ancient Egyptians called this fertile soil Kemet, meaning black land, in contrast to the Deshret, the red land of the desert. This reliable agricultural cycle meant that communities along the Nile could settle permanently, plant crops, and build surplus food stores. Surplus food meant population growth. Population growth meant specialization of labor, and specialization meant the development of arts, crafts, administration, and eventually civilization itself. By 5000 BCE, dozens of independent communities had established themselves along the Nile. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated settlements with organized layouts, specialized workshops, and evidence of long-distance trade. At sites like Badari, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis, we find evidence of advanced pottery making, metalworking, and artistic traditions. These weren't isolated villages, they were interconnected communities that traded goods, shared ideas, and gradually developed common cultural practices. The art from this period reveals a distinctly African aesthetic, similar to traditions found throughout the continent. Elongated figures, ceremonial objects, and spiritual symbolism all point to shared cultural roots with other African peoples. Over centuries, these communities began to coalesce into two distinct regions. In the north, where the Nile spreads into the Mediterranean, numerous settlements formed what would be called Lower Egypt, represented by the Red Crown. In the south, along the narrow river valley, communities united into Upper Egypt, represented by the White Crown. These weren't just geographical divisions. They represented different cultures, different deities, and different ways of organizing society. Lower Egypt was wetter, more accessible to foreign trade, and culturally diverse. Upper Egypt was more isolated, more traditional, and maintained stronger connections to African spiritual practices. This is crucial to understand. Ancient Egypt did not develop in isolation from the rest of Africa. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows clear connections between early Egyptian populations and peoples from Nubia to the south, the Sahara to the west, and the Horn of Africa to the southeast. The religious practices, burial customs, artistic styles, and social structures of pre-dynastic Egypt all show African origins. The worship of animal deities, the importance of ancestor veneration, the concept of divine kingship, all these are fundamentally African traditions that Egypt would refine and elaborate, but not invent. Particularly important was the relationship with Nubia, the land immediately south of Egypt. Nubian culture was, in many ways, more advanced than early Egypt. Nubia had earlier kingdoms, earlier monumental architecture, and maintained crucial trade networks, bringing gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic goods from deep in Africa. By 3500 BCE, the stage was set for something unprecedented in human history. The Nile Valley had everything needed for civilization. Reliable food sources, natural defenses in the form of deserts on both sides, a highway for transportation and communication in the form of the river, and most importantly, a population of skilled, innovative people with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Settlements were growing into towns, towns were developing hierarchies, local leaders were becoming chiefs, chiefs were becoming kings, and kings were looking beyond their own borders, dreaming of something greater. The age of the pharaohs was about to begin. Before we meet the legendary pharaohs who would unite Egypt, we must understand the people they ruled. Ancient Egyptians were a diverse population, but overwhelmingly of African origin. with features reflecting the full spectrum of African phenotypes. Modern DNA studies and skeletal analysis consistently show that ancient Egyptians were indigenous Northeast Africans sharing genetic markers with Nubians, Ethiopians, and other African populations. The famous Egyptologist Sheikh Anta Diop spent decades proving what should have been obvious. Ancient Egyptians were Black Africans. Pre-dynastic Egypt was divided into approximately 42 regions called nomes, each governed by a local ruler called a nomarch. These nomarchs controlled irrigation systems, collected taxes, administered justice, and commanded small armies. Some nomarchs were more powerful than others, controlling strategic locations, fertile lands, or important trade routes. Competition between these local rulers drove innovation in warfare, administration, and monument building. Each wanted to prove their power and secure their legacy. One of the most mysterious figures from this period is known to us only as Scorpion, named after the hieroglyph symbol found near his image on ancient artifacts. The scorpion mace head discovered at Hierakonpolis shows a ruler wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, performing a ceremonial irrigation ritual. Scorpion appears to have been one of the first rulers to attempt unification of multiple nomes under a single authority. Archaeological evidence suggests he controlled a significant portion of Upper Egypt and may have conducted military campaigns into Lower Egypt, but ultimate unification would fall to another. Around 3100 BCE, a king named Nama, possibly the same person remembered in later tradition as Menes, achieved what no one had before. He conquered Lower Egypt and united the two lands under a single crown. The famous Nama palette commemorates this achievement, showing the king wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. On one side of the palette, Nama is shown wearing the white crown, smiting an enemy with a mace. On the reverse, he wears the red crown, inspecting the decapitated corpses of his enemies. The message is clear. Through military conquest, the two lands have become one. Nama established his capital at Memphis, strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, he could control both regions, monitor the crucial trade routes, and project power in all directions. With this act, ancient Egypt as we know it was born, and the age of the pharaohs began. But Nama wasn't just a king in the ordinary sense. He established a concept that would define Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia, the pharaoh as living god. The pharaoh wasn't merely appointed by the gods, he was a god incarnate, specifically the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god. This concept of divine kingship has deep African roots. Throughout the continent, from ancient Kush to medieval Mali, from Great Zimbabwe to Ethiopia, African cultures recognize their rulers as sacred intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Egypt took this concept and developed it to its ultimate expression. Supporting the pharaoh's divine status was an increasingly powerful priesthood. These weren't simple religious officials. They were scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, and keepers of sacred knowledge. They interpreted the will of the gods, performed complex rituals, and advised the pharaoh on matters of state. The most important priests served in the temples of major deities like Ra, the sun god, Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Ta, the creator god. But every nome, every town, every village had its local deities and local priests. Religion permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, from the grandest state ceremony to the humblest farming ritual. Behind every great pharaoh stood brilliant architects and engineers. Men like Imhotep, who would later serve Pharaoh Djoser in the Third Dynasty, represented a class of highly educated, highly skilled professionals who turned royal visions into stone reality. These architects understood geometry, astronomy, materials, science, and logistics. They commanded vast workforces, organized supply chains stretching hundreds of miles, and solved engineering problems that still impress us today. They were the unsung heroes of Egypt's golden age. Perhaps no group was more important to Egyptian civilization than the scribes. In a society where literacy was rare, scribes held enormous power. They recorded royal decrees, calculated taxes, documented legal proceedings, copied religious texts, and maintained the historical records that allow us to know this story today. Becoming a scribe required years of training, learning thousands of hieroglyphic symbols, mastering several scripts, and understanding mathematics, law, and religious texts. But the reward was significant. Scribes could rise to positions of great authority regardless of their birth status. It was one of the few paths to social mobility in ancient Egypt. But Egypt's greatness wasn't built by pharaohs, priests, and scribes alone. It was built by millions of ordinary people. Farmers who worked the fields, craftsmen who created beautiful objects, soldiers who defended the borders, sailors who navigated the Nile, and laborers who built the monuments. Recent archaeological work has revealed that these weren't slaves, as Hollywood would have us believe. They were paid workers, often organized into specialized teams with housing, food rations, and even medical care provided. They took pride in their work, leaving behind graffiti marking their team's accomplishments. We must also recognize the crucial role of Nubia in Egypt's development. Nubians weren't just neighbors or conquered peoples. They were partners, rivals, sometimes rulers, and always an integral part of Egypt's story. Nubian kingdoms had their own pharaohs, their own pyramids, their own sophisticated culture. At times, Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt itself, particularly during the 25th dynasty. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was complex, but fundamentally, it was a relationship between African siblings, not between Europe and Africa, as later colonial narratives would suggest. With Nama's conquest around 3100 BCE, Egypt entered the dynastic period. The first dynasty established Memphis as the administrative capital and began the process of integrating two very different regions into a cohesive state. This wasn't easy. For generations after unification, tensions remained between Upper and Lower Egypt. Early pharaohs spent much of their energy balancing competing interests, suppressing rebellions, and creating new traditions that could unite both regions under a shared identity. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, became the ultimate symbol of unified rule. Royal titulary became increasingly complex, with pharaohs taking on multiple names reflecting their dominion over both lands. The early pharaohs established their primary burial ground at Abydos in Upper Egypt, a site that would remain sacred throughout Egyptian history. These early royal tombs were impressive structures, though modest compared to what would come later. Inside these tombs, archaeologists have discovered sophisticated grave goods, finely crafted furniture, jewelry, pottery, and even wine jars labeled with vintage years. This was a civilization already developing complex industries, trade networks, and a refined aesthetic sense. Disturbingly, evidence from First Dynasty tombs suggests that royal burials included human sacrifice, with servants killed to accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife. This practice, found in several early African kingdoms, would eventually be abandoned in favor of symbolic servant figures called ushabti. the Second Dynasty, and internal conflict. The Second Dynasty was marked by internal religious and political conflict. Some pharaohs of this period took names associated with Set, the god of chaos and the desert, rather than Horus, suggesting a power struggle between different factions or regions. Archaeological evidence shows that several Second Dynasty pharaohs faced serious rebellions. Some monuments were deliberately damaged. Some records were erased, suggesting violent political upheavals. Egypt's unity was still fragile, still being tested. The last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, Khasekhemwy, managed to restore unity, taking a name that meant the two powers appear. His reign marked a turning point, setting the stage for Egypt's first true golden age. Around 2670 BCE, Pharaoh Djoser commissioned a tomb unlike any seen before. His architect Imhotep created the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the world's first large-scale stone building and the prototype for all pyramids to come. The Step Pyramid started as a traditional mastaba tomb but was expanded upward in stages, creating a 6-layered structure rising over 200 feet high. It was surrounded by a complex of temples, courtyards, and ceremonial buildings, all enclosed within a massive limestone wall. Imhotep himself would be remembered as one of history's greatest geniuses, later deified as a god of wisdom and medicine. He represented the pinnacle of African intellectual achievement, a man who revolutionized architecture, astronomy, and medicine in one lifetime. The Fourth Dynasty represents the absolute pinnacle of pyramid construction. 3 pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, built the 3 great pyramids of Giza, monuments so precisely engineered, so impossibly massive, that they've sparked wonder and speculation for millennia. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, completed around 2560 BCE, contained approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing up to 70 tons, transported from quarries miles away and assembled with gaps between blocks smaller than a human hair. It stood 481 feet tall, making it the world's tallest structure for over 3,800 years. How was this achieved? Recent archaeological discoveries suggest a combination of methods: ramps, both straight and spiral, water channels for lubrication, teams of workers organized with military precision, and possibly technologies we've yet to fully understand. Excavations of workers' villages near the pyramids reveal that these monuments were built by paid Egyptian workers, not slaves. They lived in organized towns, received regular food rations including meat and beer, and had access to medical care. Graffiti left by work gangs shows pride in their labor, with teams competing for prestige. The Great Sphinx, likely built during Khafre's reign, adds another layer of mystery. This colossal limestone statue with a human head and lion's body has sparked endless debate about its age, purpose, and symbolism. Some evidence suggests it might be even older than the pyramids themselves, possibly carved from a natural limestone outcrop in pre-dynastic times. 5th and 6th dynasties, refinement and expansion. The 5th dynasty shifted focus somewhat from a pyramid building to the construction of sun temples, reflecting the growing importance of the sun god Ra. Pyramids continued to be built but were smaller and used different construction techniques. However, this period gave us one of Egypt's most important innovations, the pyramid texts. These are the oldest religious writings in human history, carved into the walls of pyramid burial chambers, providing spells, prayers, and instructions for the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife. The 6th dynasty saw aggressive expansion southward into Nubia and eastward into Sinai. Pharaohs sent trading expeditions to the land of Punt, somewhere on the Red Sea coast, bringing back exotic goods like myrrh, ebony, and leopard skins. This period also gives us some of our first biographical texts. Nobles began decorating their tombs with detailed accounts of their achievements, giving us invaluable insights into daily life, warfare, trade, and administration during the Old Kingdom. Around 2200 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The exact causes remain debated, but evidence points to a combination of factors. Climate change causing reduced Nile floods, overextension of resources on monument building, and growing power of provincial nomarchs who challenged royal authority. Egypt fragmented into competing regions. Nomarchs declared themselves independent rulers. Two major rival dynasties emerged, one based in Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt, another in Thebes in Upper Egypt. For over a century, Egypt endured civil war, famine, and cultural disruption. Literary texts from this period, like the Admonitions of Ipuwer and the Prophecy of Neferti, describe social chaos, poverty, and the breakdown of traditional order. While possibly exaggerated for literary effect, they reflect real trauma experienced during this period. Yet, even during this dark age, Egyptian culture persisted. Local rulers built temples, artists created beautiful objects, scribes continued writing. This wasn't a return to barbarism, but a period of political decentralization, during which Egyptian culture actually spread more widely throughout society. Around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep II, a pharaoh from Thebes in Upper Egypt, finally defeated his rivals and reunified Egypt, establishing the 11th dynasty and inaugurating what historians call the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep built an innovative mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, combining pyramid, temple, and tomb in a unique design that influenced later constructions. He presented himself as Egypt's savior, the man who restored Ma'at, the cosmic order that Egyptians believed was essential for civilization. The 12th dynasty, beginning around 1985 BCE, represents what many scholars consider classical Egyptian civilization. These pharaohs were master administrators who reorganized the government, launched massive irrigation and land reclamation projects, and created efficient bureaucratic systems that would influence all subsequent Egyptian history. Pharaohs like Amenemhat III transformed the Fayum Depression into a productive agricultural region, building dams, canals, and reservoirs in one of history's first large-scale environmental engineering projects. This wasn't just conquest, it was the creation of new land, new wealth, and new possibilities for Egypt's growing population. These pharaohs also built a chain of massive fortresses in Nubia, controlling trade routes and projecting Egyptian power deep into Africa. These weren't simple military outposts, but sophisticated administrative centers with complex layouts, multiple defensive walls, and impressive architectural features. The Middle Kingdom also produced Egypt's greatest literature. The story of Sinuhe, the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, wisdom texts, and love poetry all flourished during this period. Egyptian language evolved to its classical form, the standard that would be taught to scribes for centuries. Middle Kingdom art became more realistic, showing pharaohs with careworn faces rather than idealized perfection. This reflected a more complex view of kingship, acknowledging the burden of rule while maintaining divine status. Around 1650 BCE, central authority collapsed again. But this time, Egypt faced something unprecedented: foreign invasion and occupation. A Semitic people called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, gradually infiltrated the Nile Delta, eventually establishing their own dynasty, ruling from the city of Avaris. They brought new military technology, particularly the horse-drawn chariot, which gave them a decisive advantage. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian culture, worshipped Egyptian gods, and used Egyptian administrative systems. They didn't destroy Egyptian civilization, but ruled as pharaohs themselves, creating a complex cultural hybrid. However, Egyptian dynasties continued to rule in Thebes in the south. For nearly a century, Egypt was divided between Hyksos rulers in the north and native Egyptian rulers in the south, with Nubian kingdoms watching and sometimes intervening from further south. Around 1570 BCE, the Theban pharaoh Sekhenen-Retau began military campaigns against the Hyksos. His mummy shows brutal head wounds, suggesting he died in battle. His sons continued the fight. Amos-Aya finally succeeded in expelling the Hyksos around 1550 BCE, pursuing them into Canaan to ensure they couldn't return. He reunified Egypt once again and established the 18th dynasty, inaugurating the new kingdom, Egypt's Imperial age. Importantly, the Egyptians learned from their conquerors. They adopted chariot warfare, improved metallurgy, and developed a more militaristic culture. The trauma of foreign occupation transformed Egypt from an inward-looking civilization into an aggressive empire. Through military campaigns north into Syria, Palestine, and south into Nubia, they created the largest territory Egypt would ever control, stretching from the Euphrates River to the fourth cataract of the Nile. Thutmose III, who reigned from approximately 1479 to 1425 BCE, was Egypt's greatest military strategist, personally leading 17 campaigns, conquering numerous cities, and establishing Egyptian dominance throughout the Near East. He's been called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, though perhaps Napoleon should be called the Thutmose of France. Egypt became fabulously wealthy. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, horses from Syria, exotic goods from throughout the known world. Egypt's pharaohs corresponded as equals with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittites. But perhaps the most remarkable pharaoh of this dynasty was Hatshepsut, one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh rather than queen. She came to power around 1473 BCE, initially as regent for her young stepson, but then declared herself pharaoh, complete with false beard and male regalia. Hatshepsut focused on trade and building rather than conquest. Her famous expedition to the land of Punt, documented in beautiful reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, brought back myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and gold. She built extensively throughout Egypt, creating some of its most beautiful monuments. The 18th dynasty also witnessed one of history's strangest episodes, the religious revolution of Akhenaten. Around 1353 BCE, this pharaoh abandoned traditional Egyptian polytheism, declaring that only one god existed, Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and attempted to erase the old gods from Egyptian consciousness. Akhenaten's revolution produced a distinctive art style, with elongated skulls, curved bodies, and intimate family scenes previously unknown in Egyptian art. But it was deeply unpopular. After his death, his successors systematically destroyed his monuments, erased his name, and returned Egypt to traditional religion. One of those successors was the boy king Tutankhamun, who died young around 1323 BCE. Though relatively unimportant in his own time, his intact tomb, discovered in 1922, gave the world its most complete glimpse of royal burial practices and New Kingdom wealth. The 19th dynasty produced Egypt's most famous pharaoh, Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, who reigned for an astonishing 66 years from 1279 to 1213 BCE. Ramesses was Egypt's greatest builder, constructing more monuments, statues, and temples than any other pharaoh. His colossal statues dominated the landscape, his cartouches appeared on buildings throughout Egypt, and his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, was among the largest ever built. His greatest achievement was Abu Simbel, carved directly into a mountainside in Nubia. 4 massive seated statues of Ramesses, each 67 feet tall, guard the entrance to a temple that extends 180 feet into the rock. Twice a year, on specific dates, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple to illuminate statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary, a feat of astronomical and architectural precision. Ramesses also fought the Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, one of the largest chariot battles in history. Though Ramesses claimed total victory in his inscriptions, the battle was actually a stalemate. What's more significant is what followed, the first recorded peace treaty in human history, establishing recognized borders and mutual defense obligations between Egypt and the Hittites. Ramesses lived into his 90s, outliving many of his children and wives. His mummy, discovered in a cache of royal mummies in 1881, shows an elderly man with red hair, arthritic joints, and evidence of dental disease. Even in death, his presence commands respect, but maintaining an empire proved expensive. Later, New Kingdom pharaohs struggled with economic problems, inflation, administrative corruption, and the constant need to defend distant territories. The great building projects became smaller, less frequent, less impressive. Around 1200 BCE, a catastrophe struck the entire eastern Mediterranean. Mysterious groups, collectively called the Sea Peoples, destroyed kingdoms throughout the region. The Hittite Empire collapsed completely. Many Canaanite cities were burned. Egypt barely survived, with Ramesses III fighting off multiple invasions. Ramesses III successfully defended Egypt, but at enormous cost. His reign marked the last period of significant Egyptian power. After his death, Egypt entered a period of slow decline, with the empire gradually fragmenting. The high priests of Ammon in Thebes controlled the south, while various dynasties ruled the north from cities like Tanis. At times, Egypt had multiple pharaohs simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy. Libyan military commanders who had settled in Egypt gradually gained power, eventually establishing their own dynasties. These Libyan pharaohs adopted Egyptian culture completely, proving once again that Egyptian civilization was defined by culture, not ethnicity. The Nubian Renaissance, the 25th dynasty. But the most remarkable development came from the south. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia, which had maintained Egyptian cultural traditions even when Egypt itself declined, invaded and conquered Egypt around 747 BCE. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, particularly Taharqa, presented themselves as restorers of true Egyptian tradition. They renovated temples, revived old religious practices, and built pyramids in both Egypt and Nubia. These Black Pharaohs from deep in Africa ruled Egypt for nearly a century. The Nubian civilization that produced these pharaohs was sophisticated in its own right, with its own writing system, Meroitic script, ironworking technology, and distinctive artistic traditions. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was always one of cultural exchange, not simple domination. The Nubian dynasty ended when the Assyrian Empire, armed with superior iron weapons, invaded Egypt around 671 BCE. After brutal warfare, the Nubians withdrew to their homeland in the south, where their civilization would continue to flourish for another 1,000 years. The late period saw brief moments of restored Egyptian independence, particularly under the 26th dynasty, when pharaohs like Psamtik I reunified Egypt and attempted to revive its glory. But Egypt was now surrounded by greater powers and could never again achieve its former dominance. In 525 BCE, the Persian Empire conquered Egypt, making it a province of the largest empire the world had yet seen. Some Persian rulers respected Egyptian culture and ruled as pharaohs. Others were brutal and exploitative. Egyptian nationalism never died, leading to repeated rebellions. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedon conquered Egypt, ending Persian rule. The Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, where he was declared the son of Amun, a pharaoh in the Egyptian tradition. Alexander founded Alexandria, which would become one of history's greatest cities, a center of learning, trade, and culture that blended Egyptian, Greek, and Near Eastern influences. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic period, Greek pharaohs. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as pharaohs for nearly 3 centuries, from 323 to 30 BCE. They adopted Egyptian royal regalia, built temples to Egyptian gods, and maintained many Egyptian traditions, while simultaneously promoting Greek culture and language. They made Alexandria a beacon of learning, establishing the Great Library and the museum, where scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world studied, conducted research, and expanded human knowledge. This was the city where Euclid wrote his geometry, where Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference, where the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible was created. The last Ptolemaic ruler and the last pharaoh of independent Egypt was Cleopatra VII. Contrary to popular belief, Cleopatra was an intellectual and a skilled politician who spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, the first Ptolemaic ruler to do so in centuries. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were political alliances aimed at preserving Egyptian independence against Roman expansion. She nearly succeeded, but the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE ended her hopes. Rather than be paraded through Rome as a captive, she chose death, reportedly by snake bite, in 30 BCE. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a Roman province. The age of the pharaohs, which had lasted over 3,000 years, finally ended. For centuries, Western scholarship has systematically denied or minimized Egypt's African identity. European and American museums, textbooks, and popular media have consistently depicted ancient Egyptians as white or Middle Eastern, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This erasure began with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. French scholars accompanying his army were amazed by Egypt's monuments, but immediately began constructing narratives that separated Egypt from Africa. They claimed Egypt must have been founded by migrants from Asia or even Europe, refusing to credit African peoples with such achievements. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, racist pseudoscience invented increasingly absurd theories. Ancient Egyptians were a lost white race. They were descended from Atlanteans. They came from a sunken continent. anything but the obvious truth that they were indigenous Africans. Modern genetic studies consistently show that ancient Egyptians were indigenous Northeast Africans closely related to modern Ethiopians, Somalis, and Sudanese populations. Skeletal analysis shows African features. Artistic depictions in tombs show people with dark skin, particularly in Nubian contexts. African scholars, particularly Senegalese physicist and historian Cheikh Anta Diop, spent decades proving Egypt's African identity through linguistic analysis, melanin testing of mummies, cultural comparisons, and historical documentation. His work, though initially dismissed by European academics, has been increasingly vindicated by modern science. Egyptian religion wasn't unique or borrowed from Asia. It was fundamentally African. The worship of animal deities, the importance of ancestor spirits, the concept of divine kingship, elaborate burial practices, and the emphasis on cosmic balance all have clear parallels throughout African civilizations. The Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge strikingly similar to ancient Egyptian beliefs. The Yoruba of Nigeria have pantheons of gods resembling Egyptian deities. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic balance, appears throughout African philosophical traditions. These aren't coincidences, but evidence of shared African cultural foundations. A linguistic analysis reveals connections between ancient Egyptian and various African language families. Coptic, the latest form of the Egyptian language, survived into the modern era in the Egyptian Christian Church and shows clear African linguistic structures. One of the most persistent myths is that the pyramids were built by slaves, particularly Hebrew slaves as depicted in biblical stories and Hollywood movies. This is completely false. Archaeological evidence overwhelmingly shows that pyramids were built by paid Egyptian workers. Recent discoveries have revealed sophisticated construction techniques, internal ramps spiraling up inside the pyramid structure, water channels to reduce friction when moving blocks, precise astronomical alignments for orientation, and mathematical knowledge that allowed perfectly level bases and precise angles. Graffiti left by workers shows they were organized into teams with names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkore. They took pride in their work. This was a national effort with workers from throughout Egypt participating in a project that would ensure their pharaoh's immortality and by extension Egypt's cosmic harmony. The workers' cemetery at Giza shows that laborers received medical care, were buried with honors, and were not treated as disposable slaves. This was organized labor on a grand scale, but it was Egyptian labor, African labor, building monuments that would outlast empires. Another hidden truth is the remarkable status of women in ancient Egypt. Compared to most ancient civilizations, Egyptian women enjoyed remarkable rights and freedoms. They could own property, conduct business, divorce their husbands, serve as priests, and even rule as pharaohs. Legal texts show women controlling their own wealth, making contracts, and bringing lawsuits. Marriage was viewed as a partnership, not ownership. Women weren't veiled or secluded, but participated fully in public life. While Hatshepsut and Cleopatra are famous, they weren't alone. Sobekneferu ruled in the 12th dynasty. Tausret ruled at the end of the 19th dynasty. Several queens served as regents wielding real power. This wasn't an accident, but reflected deeper cultural values about female capability and divine feminine power. Egyptian religion placed goddesses in positions of ultimate power. Isis was the goddess of magic, more powerful than even Ra. Hathor was the goddess of love, joy, and also violence. Sekhmet was the lion-headed warrior goddess who nearly destroyed humanity. Divine power wasn't exclusively masculine in Egyptian thought. Ancient Egypt possessed medical knowledge far ahead of its time. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but copying older texts, describes 48 surgical cases with remarkable anatomical accuracy. It distinguishes between treatable, possibly treatable, and untreatable conditions. A rational approach to medicine. Egyptian physicians performed surgery, set broken bones, treated wounds, prescribed medications, and even created prosthetics. A mummy from around 950 BCE was found with a prosthetic big toe made of wood and leather, fully functional and showing signs of long use. Egyptian mathematics was sophisticated enough to calculate the volume of pyramids, determine the area of circles, solve linear equations, and work with fractions. The Rind mathematical papyrus shows the Egyptians understood geometry, algebra, and practical mathematics centuries before the Greeks. Egyptian astronomy allowed precise calendar creation, prediction of Nile floods based on stellar observations, and orientation of buildings to celestial events. The Egyptian calendar of 365 days was later adopted by Rome and forms the basis of our modern calendar. Perhaps the most suppressed aspect of Egyptian history is its intimate relationship with Nubia. Western scholarship has often portrayed Nubia as Egypt's primitive southern neighbor, when in reality, Nubian civilization was often equal to or ahead of Egypt. Recent archaeological work shows that in pre-dynastic times, Nubia may have been more culturally advanced than Egypt. The A group culture in Nubia had wealthy burials and long-distance trade before similar developments in Egypt. Some scholars now argue that the concept of kingship itself may have traveled north from Nubia to Egypt. The 25th dynasty proves that Nubians could rule Egypt as successfully as any native Egyptian dynasty. The cultural exchange between Egypt and Nubia was a bi-directional, with ideas, gods, artistic styles, and technologies flowing both ways. When Egypt fell to foreign powers, Nubian kingdoms continued to thrive. The kingdom of Kush maintained Egyptian cultural traditions, built pyramids more than Egypt itself, and survived until 350 CE, long after Egypt had lost its independence. Ancient Egypt wasn't isolated from the rest of Africa, but was deeply connected through trade networks extending throughout the continent. Gold from West Africa, ebony from Central Africa, incense from the Horn of Africa, and exotic animals from throughout the continent all flowed through Egypt. These weren't just material goods, but cultural exchanges. Religious ideas, artistic styles, technological innovations, and political concepts circulated throughout African trade networks. Egypt was the most famous node in these networks, but it was part of a larger African world. The mysterious land of Punt, which Egyptians visited for centuries, was most likely located in what is now Somalia, Eritrea, or nearby regions. The reliefs showing Punt's queen with distinctive features, the goods brought back mere gold ebony animals, all point to an East African location. Ancient Greece openly acknowledged its debt to Egypt. Greek philosophers like Thales, Pythagoras, and Plato traveled to Egypt to study with Egyptian priests. Much of what we call Greek mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy was actually learned from African sources. Greek architecture borrowed heavily from Egypt. Columns, capitals, and the entire concept of monumental stone temples came from Egypt. The famous Greek orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, evolved from Egyptian prototypes. Rome was even more explicit in borrowing from Egypt. After conquering Egypt, Romans transported obelisks to Rome, where they still stand today, adopted Egyptian gods into Roman religion, particularly Isis worship, and borrowed Egyptian administrative systems. Egyptian religious concepts profoundly influenced both Judaism and Christianity. the concept of judgment after death, resurrection, the triumph of good over evil, even monotheism itself through Akhenaten's revolution, or had Egyptian precedents that influenced later religions. During the Islamic Golden Age, Muslim scholars studied ancient Egypt intensely, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The word chemistry comes from al-chem, the Arabic name for Egypt, reflecting Egypt's reputation for advanced knowledge. Egypt's influence flowed throughout Africa. Nubian kingdoms continued Egyptian traditions. Aksumite, Ethiopia, adopted Egyptian architectural elements and religious concepts. West African kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai built on Egyptian administrative models. The concept of divine kingship, elaborate court rituals, monumental architecture, complex religious systems all continued throughout African history in kingdoms from Great Zimbabwe to the Kingdom of Congo. Egypt wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but the most developed expression of broader African cultural patterns. Modern African nations recognize Egypt as part of their shared heritage. Pan-African movements have consistently pointed to Egypt as proof of African civilization's antiquity and sophistication. Egypt represents African potential, African achievement, African genius. Modern Egypt maintains a complex relationship with its ancient past. The monuments attract millions of tourists, generating crucial revenue. Egyptian national identity incorporates pharaonic symbolism alongside Arab and Islamic elements. Egypt has increasingly asserted control over its archaeological heritage, demanding the return of artifacts from Western museums and developing world-class facilities like the Grand Egyptian Museum to display its treasures. Globally, interest in ancient Egypt remains intense. New discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. Advanced technologies like satellite archaeology, DNA analysis, and 3D modeling reveal secrets that have remained hidden for millennia. Tragically, much of Egypt's heritage has been destroyed. Early Christians and Muslims sometimes destroyed pagan temples. European collectors looted monuments. Early archaeologists destroyed contexts in their rush for treasure. Climate change and modern development continue to threaten sites. The loss of the Great Library of Alexandria, burned multiple times over centuries, destroyed an irreplaceable repository of ancient knowledge. Who knows what we might have learned if those hundreds of thousands of scrolls had survived. Yet what survives is still extraordinary. Thousands of temples, tombs, and monuments, millions of artifacts in museums worldwide, countless papyrus texts revealing everything from religious beliefs to grocery lists, and most remarkably, the Egyptian language itself, which survived in Coptic and was eventually deciphered through the Rosetta Stone in 1822. Egyptology remains a vibrant field with new discoveries constantly changing our understanding. The tomb of Tutankhamun was found only in 1922. The Workers' Cemetery at Giza was excavated in the 1990s. New pyramids are still being discovered using satellite technology. Debates continue about Egypt's racial identity, its relationships with other civilizations, and how to interpret its legacy. These aren't just academic questions, but deeply political ones involving issues of African identity, colonialism's legacy, and who gets to tell history. Increasingly, African scholars are reclaiming Egyptian history from Western-dominated narratives. They are highlighting African continuities, challenging racist interpretations, and placing Egypt firmly within African history where it belongs. What can modern civilization learn from ancient Egypt? First, that Africa has always been at the forefront of human achievement. The narrative of Africa as a dark continent waiting for European enlightenment is a lie. Africa enlightened the world. Second, Egypt teaches us about sustainability and long-term thinking. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years understood something about balance, about living within limits, about building for eternity rather than a short-term gain. Third, Egypt shows what human cooperation can achieve. The pyramids weren't built by slaves, but by organized communities working toward shared goals. When people unite with common purpose, when they believe in something greater than themselves, they can accomplish the impossible. Fourth, Egypt reminds us that knowledge must be preserved and transmitted. The scribes who copied texts, the priests who guarded wisdom, the teachers who trained students, they ensured that Egyptian civilization survived across millennia. In our digital age, we must ask, what are we preserving for future generations? Finally, Egypt teaches us about cultural exchange and adaptation. Egyptian civilization absorbed influences from throughout Africa and the Mediterranean, adapting them creatively while maintaining core values. Great civilizations aren't isolated but actively engage with the world around them. Standing on the banks of the Nile today, you can see the same river that nourished the world's first great civilization. The water flows north just as it did 5,000 years ago. The desert stretches east and west just as it always has. The sun rises and sets with the same reliability that allowed ancient Egyptians to create a calendar that we still use. But something profound has changed. The civilization that once seemed eternal has passed into history, leaving behind monuments so massive that they dwarf the people who now live among them. These stone witnesses stand as reminders of what human beings can achieve when they believe in something greater than themselves. The story of ancient Egypt is fundamentally a story about African achievement. It demolishes the racist narrative that Africa contributed nothing to world civilization. Africa didn't just contribute. Africa led, Africa innovated, Africa built monuments that still inspire awe. Africa developed systems of knowledge that other civilizations would later adopt and claim as their own. For centuries, Western scholarship worked to separate Egypt from Africa, to claim its achievements for white civilization or mysterious lost races, but the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Ancient Egyptians were black Africans who built one of history's greatest civilizations through their own genius, their own labor, their own vision. Egypt's 3,000-year continuity teaches us something profound about cultural resilience. Despite invasions, famines, civil wars, and foreign occupation, Egyptian civilization maintained its core identity across millennia. The same gods were worshipped, the same artistic conventions followed, the same language spoken for longer than the entire span of recorded Western history. This wasn't because Egyptians were isolated or unchanging. They constantly adapted, absorbed new ideas, and responded to challenges. But they did so while maintaining a strong sense of who they were, what they valued, and where they came from. Yet the greatest tragedy of Egyptian history isn't its eventual decline, but how it's been erased, distorted, and appropriated. Walk into almost any Western museum and you'll see Egyptian artifacts torn from their context, displayed as curiosities, their African origins downplayed or denied. Watch almost any Hollywood movie about ancient Egypt and you'll see white actors are playing pharaohs, European features imposed on African faces, and a civilization that looks more like Rome than Africa. This isn't innocent artistic license. It's cultural theft on a massive scale. The fight to reclaim Egypt's true history, to restore its African identity, to give credit where credit is due, continues. Every time we tell this story accurately, every time we challenge the false narratives, every time we center Africa in Egypt's story, we strike a blow against the lies that have sustained racism and colonialism. For modern Africa, Egypt's legacy carries multiple meanings. It proves that Africa has always been capable of greatness, that African civilizations have risen to heights that rivaled or exceeded any other civilization. When people claim that Africa needs outside intervention to develop, Egypt stands as evidence that Africa has always had the capacity to shape its own destiny. But Egypt's legacy also carries a warning. Great civilizations can fall, knowledge can be lost, glory can fade. The monuments that seemed eternal can become tourist attractions in someone else's narrative. Maintaining civilization requires constant effort, constant vigilance, constant commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Yet Egypt's story transcends Africa. It speaks to all humanity about what we're capable of achieving when we organize ourselves effectively, when we think beyond our individual lifetimes, when we commit to something larger than ourselves. The mathematical precision of the pyramids, the architectural sophistication of the temples, the medical knowledge recorded in papyri, the literary beauty of Egyptian texts, all these represent human potential at its highest expression. They remind us that our ancestors, regardless of where they lived, were brilliant, capable, and creative. Egyptian wisdom texts, with their emphasis on justice, truth, balance, and social responsibility, still speak to us across the millennia. The concept of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that must be maintained for society to function, seems remarkably relevant in our modern world of ecological crisis and social instability. The Nile still flows, life still flourishes along its banks, and the monuments still stand, slowly eroding but still magnificent, still inspiring wonder in everyone who sees them. Ancient Egypt ended over 2,000 years ago, but its legacy endures in ways both obvious and subtle. Modern engineers still study in pyramid construction. Modern astronomers examine Egyptian star charts. Modern artists draw inspiration from Egyptian aesthetics. The ancient Egyptians achieved something that even they might not have fully understood. They built not just monuments, but ideas, not just tombs, but concepts that would outlive them by millennia. This is the ultimate lesson of ancient Egypt. True greatness transcends time. When you create something meaningful, when you build something beautiful, when you establish principles worth living by, you achieve a form of immortality that no tomb, no matter how grand, can guarantee. The story of ancient Egypt is one of the greatest stories ever told. It's a story of African genius, of human potential, of civilization rising from the banks of a river to transform the world. It's a story that has been hidden, distorted, and appropriated, but which refuses to die because the evidence is written in stone that will outlast us all. Here at Africa Hidden History, we are committed to telling the true stories of African civilizations, free from colonial distortions and racist erasures. Ancient Egypt is just one chapter in Africa's extraordinary history. There are so many more stories to tell. In upcoming episodes, we'll explore the kingdom of Kush and the Black Pharaohs who ruled from Nubia, the ancient kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia, and its connections to the legends of the Queen of Sheba, the great West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and the mysteries of great Zimbabwe and the advanced civilizations of Southern Africa. If you want to continue this journey through Africa's hidden history, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we bring you a new documentary exploring the stories that mainstream history ignores or distorts. Leave a comment below telling us what aspect of ancient Egypt fascinates you most. What would you like to know more about? What questions do you still have? What other African civilizations should we cover next? Your engagement helps us grow and reach more people with these important stories. Follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content, additional research materials, and ongoing discussions about African history. We're building a community of people committed to learning and sharing the true history of Africa. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are, where we came from, and what we're capable of achieving. Every time we reclaim a hidden story, every time we challenge a false narrative, every time we center African voices in African history, we take back power. The ancient Egyptians believed that the sun died every evening and was reborn every morning, a cycle of death and renewal that would continue forever. In the same way, the truth of Egypt's African identity died in colonial narratives, but is being reborn in the work of scholars, educators, and communities committed to historical accuracy. The sun rises on a new understanding of Africa's past, and it's glorious. This has been Africa Hidden History. Until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep questioning the narratives, and keep celebrating Africa's extraordinary legacy.